Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's event is entitled The Nazi Camp Universe, 1933 to 1945, Landscapes of Suffering and Paths of Persecution, and features Dr. Alexandra Lohse, Applied Research Scholar Team Lead at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Lohse's talk is part of the KHC's 2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium that's also entitled Incarceration, Transformation, and Paths to Liberation During the Holocaust and Beyond. It's also connected to the KHC's newest exhibition, The Concentration Camps, Inside the Nazi System of Incarceration and Genocide, which we'll give you a sneak peek of a little bit later during the conversation. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Holocaust Genocide and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, the Ray Walpow Institute at Western Washington University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, and the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center. There are many of you tuning in today, Holocaust survivors and second-generation survivors, scholars, community members, museum staff, educators, and students, people from all backgrounds, all faiths, and all ages from across the country. The relevancy of Dr. Lohse's talk cannot be underscored enough. In the past few weeks alone, the history of the Holocaust is once again at the forefront of the news, including the banning of the seminal graphic novel Mouse in a local Tennessee school district, and discussions around the racialization of Jewish people. Today's conversation is as much for those of you who are very familiar with these debates, as well as crucially for the students joining us who are beginning to learn about this and or deepening their understanding of this terrible history. So there's two more quick notes before we begin. One, the event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it later. And also, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest, Dr. Alexandra Lohse. Dr. Lohse joined the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies in 2017 as an applied research scholar and editor of the forthcoming 6th volume of the museum's Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, 1933 to 1945, on extermination, labor, and transit camps for Jews. In 2020, she started serving as series editor, coordinating the work of in-house and external researchers and volume editors to complete the encyclopedia series. Dr. Lohse's research focuses on German society during World War II and on the nature and endurance of popular support for the Nazi regime during the final war years. Her book, Prevail Unto the Bitter End, Germans in the Waning Years of World War II from Cornell University Press is forthcoming. Dr. Lohse first contributed to the Encyclopedia Project as a contract researcher between 2012 and 2015 when she wrote original content for several volumes of the series. She has also worked at the National Archives and served as staff historian for the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command. Dr. Lohse, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura, for this kind introduction and for having me here today as part of the programming around your really excellent online exhibit. All right. Now, as someone who grapples daily with the complexities of Nazi camps, I'm always excited to learn how others approach this really challenging topic. And of course, I'm really excited and grateful for this opportunity to share a little bit about what I've learned and continue to learn. I want to acknowledge the contributions of the Silberman Foundation for my participation here. And with that, I would like to start. Nicholas Waxman, a very prominent historian of the camp system, recently put it like this: Nazi Germany was a land of camps. And indeed, we know that from the very early days of the Nazi regime, camps served as a central tool and as a defining tool of terror repression that the Nazis deployed against a host of real and perceived enemies. Initially, camp-based persecution under the Nazi regime focused largely on political enemies of the regime that included communists, social democrats, unionists, and others. But it also quickly encompassed social outsiders, various categories of medical patients, and others that the Nazis deemed a threat to the health and prosperity of the nation. This category would eventually encompass a host of racially defined enemies, most critically Jews. Patterns of incarceration, punishment, and terror that were established inside Germany in the 1930s would ultimately be applied and magnified in a camp system that spread across Nazi-occupied and Nazi-allied Europe. Indeed, under the conditions of war, these sites proliferated to create the largest and most pervasive camp system of the modern era, spanning from France, Belgium, the Netherlands in the west, to Poland, the Baltic states, and the outer territories of the USSR in the east, from Norway in the north to Romania, Yugoslavia, Greece, and all the way into Northern Africa in the south. In a way that is almost impossible to comprehend today, Nazi and Nazi-allied camps dominated and defined the European landscape during World War II and even well after the war, when many of the original Nazi camps were repurposed to house displaced persons, refugees, and POWs. So to my mind, understanding Nazi camps is absolutely central to any understanding of how the Nazi regime operated during this very short but extremely destructive period in 20th century history. So my goal then for today, for this talk, is to illuminate some of the important aspects of the Nazi camp system in two steps. First, I would like to give you a very brief high-level overview of the Nazi camp system, including some statistics of the staggering scale of the camps phenomenon. As part of this talk, I would like to highlight some of the commonalities and patterns that I believe define the system as a whole. In the second part, I would like to take you from the very high level to the very grassroots level, and from the commonalities to the specifics and particulars, by exploring with you very briefly a case study of one lesser known but very well documented camp that operated inside Nazi Germany. In both the high level and the grassroots level discussions of my talk, I will emphasize repeatedly the very dynamic and the very ever-changing character of the camp system, in which victims traveled countless paths of persecution between 1933 and 1945. One of the reasons that I'm here to talk with you about Nazi camps today is that, as Laura said, I am part of a team of researchers at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, working on a massive research project that aims to document as comprehensively as possible the Nazi camp universe in our multi-volume USHMM Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, 1933 through 1945. For those of us in the field of Holocaust studies, it is impossible to overstate the enormity of this project's ambition and the transformative nature of the results that it has yielded, and that I believe it will yield for a very long time to come as a foundational resource, especially once the series is available in its entirety. This is true, even though in hindsight, it can appear that the project had seemingly modest origins. When research on this series began roughly 25 years ago, my colleagues expected to cover some 5,000 to 7,000 Nazi camps. At the time, in the early days of our institution, and with the field of Holocaust studies still in its infancy, these numbers represented the height of scholarly understanding of the dimensions of the Nazi camp universe. Since then, of course, our field and our project have undergone a tremendous evolution, and I think it is very fair to say that each had a profound impact on the other. Both have benefited, among others, from access to new archives, from new collections, including eyewitness and survivor testimony, from the development of new methodologies in the field and the emergence of new interpretations and camp typologies. And all of these factors and more have led us to significantly revise the initial camp count. Today, my team anticipates that our project will document more than 40,000 sites, which is an almost incomprehensible number that challenges our understanding of the nature, ubiquity, and visibility of Nazi persecution as it occurred specifically in a camp setting. This number includes more than 30,000 forced labor camps for foreign civilians, by far the single largest category of Nazi camps. And it also includes concentration camps, ghettos, POW camps, resettlement and transit camps, so-called euthanasia centers, killing centers, prisons, brothels, and other persecutory sites. The SS and its collaborators ran the notorious concentration camps and killing sites that are best known today as the embodiment of Nazi terror and mass murder, and that you see roughly represented in this map. But it is important to remember that numerous other authorities also operated their own camps, and these included the military, private enterprises, large and small businesses, municipalities, and many other private, governmental, and quasi-governmental entities all ran their own camps between 1933 and 1945, and as part of this larger integrated camp system. And if we were to overlay this map here with all these other camps operated by entities beyond the SS, I think you get the sense that there would be very little of the map left uncovered. I know this because we keep trying in our work on the encyclopedia to visualize our research effectively, but the sheer scale of this camp phenomenon can very easily threaten to obscure rather than illuminate, which is why I will turn to a case study shortly. In the meantime, though, I'd like to give you just a very quick sense of our understanding of the scale of the Nazi camp system through this project outline and the associated camp counts that are part of the encyclopedia series. As you can see here, our project organizes the camp universe into 7 volumes. And in each of the volumes, we focus on a particular subset of camps grouped according to their subordination or purpose within the larger camp universe. Not surprisingly, perhaps, much of our work is based on perpetrator documentation. Anything from governmental decrees, police orders for the incarceration of certain victim groups, to building permits or construction blueprints, to prisoner lists, to individual prisoner files, as well as hospital and death records, can help our researchers trace where Nazi authorities established persecutory sites, what they looked like, and what fates the inmates suffered there. But our project also aims to give voice to the victims who lived and died within these sites. To that end, our researchers systematically mine letters, diaries, memoirs, as well as oral testimony and survivor interviews. Of course, there are limits to what we can achieve and document within the constraints of our encyclopedic format, but these types of more intimate sources, if you will, help us preserve some of the humanity of those who suffered at these sites, many of which are documented in our series for the very first time. Now, I won't read the slide, and I certainly would never expect anyone to remember all these different camp categories and camp operators, but I wanted to share it with you to give you a sense of the very big central ambition of our project, that is to create the most comprehensive documentation of the camp network in its totality, and to promote a fuller understanding of the camp system than has ever been done before. If you are interested in exploring this resource further, I would invite you to visit our page at the USHMM website, where you can download free copies of the first 3 volumes of the series, and where we hope to eventually make all our content available for free to stimulate conversation and further research as we publish the remaining volumes over the next few years. Before I move on to my case study, I want to make one last point as part of this high-level overview of the Nazi camp universe. And that point regards the fundamental purposes or functions of camps that made up this very vast and intricate camp network. As I mentioned before, the Nazi regime used camps as a preferred punitive tool to pursue a range of radical goals that ultimately aimed at a fundamental social, racial, and geopolitical restructuring of the entire European continent. These goals included the elimination of political enemies and social outsiders from German society, the systematic murder of the hereditarily ill in the name of eugenics, the decimation and conscription of entire European populations deemed racially inferior, and of course, the wholesale extermination of those deemed racial enemies, most notably European Jews. I want to dwell on the question of just how camps were deployed in the pursuit of these and other larger Nazi goals for just a minute, because I think it can be very instructive to consider the great number and variety of Nazi camps on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that on the grassroots level, these sites served fairly common, albeit radical functions. First, I would point out what may be fairly obvious, that camps served detention purposes, that is physical control. Controlling inmates' physical bodies in a confined space was one of the most fundamental and basic functions of any kind of camps during the Nazi era. Underlying this function was the belief that certain individuals or certain groups of people did not have the right to operate freely in society, but had to be physically removed, isolated, and detained. Number 2, labor and exploitation. Labor was a defining feature of camp life and death dating back to the very early days of the Nazi regime, when it was mainly used as a tool of humiliation and physical punishment. Ultimately, labor became a near universal feature of the Nazi camp universe, particularly in the later war years, when the regime tried to address its massive labor shortage and collapsing wartime economy by systematically exploiting millions of forced laborers within the Nazi camp system. Number 3, punishment and deterrence, or social control. Different groups of camp inmates were subjected to a range of physical and other harsh punishments within the camp system. This could include anything from beatings to heavy labor, as I mentioned, to torture meted out by guards and other camp personnel. But physical punishment was also inherent in the camp's infrastructure itself. In most camps, inmates suffered from catastrophic sanitary conditions and extreme overcrowding. They were afforded insufficient shelter and received insufficient rations, clothing, and little to no medical care. These were all part of the systematic and intentionally punitive conditions that were intended to cause inmates suffering and death as part of the camp experience. And number 4, murder. Inmate deaths were an accepted and intentional consequence of the punitive conditions in Nazi camps dating back to the very early days of the Nazi regime. By contrast, the full implementation of systematic murder campaigns against inmate populations occurred later and ultimately escalated under the conditions of war, when killing centers like Auschwitz-Birkenau served the industrial mass slaughter of victims that the Nazi regime believed to be racial enemies. This camp-based murder campaign targeted a number of different groups, including Roma and Sinti, as well as mentally and physically disabled patients. But first and foremost, of course, it targeted Europe's Jewish populations. With that, I want to wrap up my high-level overview and transition briefly to a discussion of one particular Nazi camp that was located in Ahlem near Hanover in Germany. And that was a site that underwent a very dramatic transformation over the course of the Nazi era and the war, from a Jewish school and a Jewish self-help institution to a Nazi detention and labor camp for German Jews, and ultimately to a staging ground for German Jews during the Holocaust. I picked this case study for several reasons. The camp that I will describe in a little more detail was fairly small, but it is very well documented. And we have an unusual amount of eyewitness and survivor testimony documenting inmates' experience in this camp, which is something that as researchers we value and treasure. Moreover, despite its relatively small size, the site played an important and perhaps outsized role in the escalating segregation, exploitation, and ultimately murder of German Jews in that region. As a consequence, then, we find all the common punitive camp functions that I just mentioned play out over time in this single site. And I hope that this case study also illuminates just how dramatically the character and the purpose of a Nazi camp could transform in answer to changing Nazi policies and priorities. So as I'm talking up this case study, I hope that you will ultimately take away from this perhaps a better appreciation of the fact that Nazi camps, regardless of their size, location, or administrations, did not operate in isolation, but were usually integrated into the huge and destructive camp network through which millions of victims were funneled before the end of the war. The site that I'm describing here began its history of all things as a Jewish school, and it was called the Israelite Horticultural School of Ahlem, which is a small community in Germany's Lower Saxony, or Niedersachsen. Today, Ahlem has been incorporated into Hanover, the state capital. For the first 4 decades of its existence, the school served as a trade and boarding school for underprivileged Jewish children and youths, many of them recent immigrants from Eastern Europe. The Ahlem school's fairly modest but successful and uneventful trajectory changed very dramatically following the appointment of Adolf Hitler as chancellor in January 1933. Early German anti-Semitic policies pushed many German Jews out of areas of public life and forced them to turn to Jewish educational, cultural, and welfare institutions for self-help. The Israelite Horticultural School served many functions of Jewish self-help during the 1930s. It provided training and education for newly marginalized Jewish children. And it also helped economically displaced Jewish adults during this time, many of whom had been forced out of their white-collar professions and who now sought training and sought to acquire manual skills as gardeners, shoemakers, tailors, and maids, among others, in hopes that these skills would aid their attempt to emigrate from hostile Germany. Looking back at the institution's unusual history throughout the 1930s and into the early war year, one former student recalled that during this time, the school seemed to him like something of an island in the brown sea of war and the harassment of Nazi persecution. In other words, for much of the early 1930s and well into the war year, people would remember this as a safe haven of sorts. In 1941, broader changes in German military and racial policy converged with important ramifications for the Ahlem school, which quickly transformed from a Jewish haven to a de facto ghetto, to a labor camp, and ultimately to a staging ground for genocide. The regional Nazi administrator of Hanover ordered the concentration of the Jewish population of the region in September 1941. Some 1,200 people were forced out of their homes and were concentrated in approximately 15 so-called Jew houses or Judenhäuser in the area, where they were forced to await deportation orders. Jewish inmates were confined in these residential camps or de facto ghettos on German soil for weeks, months, and sometimes even years. And many survivors later recalled their lives in these Jew houses in Germany as miserable, marked by sudden overcrowding, anxiety, humiliation, and arbitrary violence. Gerd Landsberg, a survivor who occupied a Jew house in Hanover for 3 months in 1941, later wrote in his memoir about the miserable conditions he experienced there that were exacerbated by the fact that the inmates were subject to sudden and arbitrary violence and harassment at the hands of the Gestapo and just ordinary German citizens. He remembered in particular that the women at his Jew house were subject to near daily sexual humiliation by men who forced them to undress and pose for their amusement. So this obviously sent a very strong signal that the conditions under which Jews now lived in Germany had changed dramatically, and whatever vestiges of rights they had up till that point had disappeared. In early 1942, parts of the Ahlem school too were registered as a Jew house, and by April 1942, more than 140 people were registered here awaiting deportation, though the number of residents of the Jew house were in constant flux due to ongoing deportations. While they awaited their deportations, inmates had to perform different kinds of forced labor, usually work related to the maintenance of the fields and the gardens of the former school grounds. And these frightening circumstances under which they now found themselves on this estate, on this former school and safe haven, obviously changed how inmates perceived their stay at Ahlem. It was no longer a refuge, but a prison in which daily life was marked by fear, anxiety, and exhaustion. One of the inhabitants of the Ahlem Jew house during this period testified after the war, quote, "We felt threatened, we were depressed, we worried a lot," end quote. Another former inmate speculated later, quote, "We all must have had similar suspicions and fears. Every thought about what may happen on the next day went to the worst case scenario, namely deportation to the east," end quote. So again, this existence that inmates at this site now lived was very much marked by fear, anxiety over the unknown, and this dreadful specter of deportation to the east that people often didn't quite know exactly what it would entail, but it was certainly frightening. The first deportations of Jews from Germany commenced between October 15th and November 5th, 1941, and the first Hanover transport was ultimately rescheduled to December of that year. In preparation, the secret police or Gestapo seized the Ahlem school to establish an assembly and transit camp that now operated parallel to the Jew house on the estate. So again, just to give you a sense of the dynamics at play here, what was once a Jewish haven and self-help institution had now been co-opted by Nazi authorities as a de facto ghetto as a labor camp, and now as a mass staging ground for those Jews of the area who were slated for deportation. The local Gestapo office deployed a number of Jewish forced laborers to the site to prepare it for the arrival of hundreds of so-called evacuees, that is, German Jews slated for deportation east. The evacuees were assembled on the grounds, where many of them were housed without adequate shelter and provisions, because the school was certainly not set up to accommodate that many people. And German authorities clearly did not care to provide them. And moreover, while they waited to be processed, they were subjected to repeated humiliating searches for values and others. One survivor testified after the war about her experience during this period. And I want to quote her here because, as I think I already suggested, with many of these smaller sites, we don't actually get the opportunity to capture victim perspectives. So that's always, from a researcher standpoint, it's certainly an impetus for us to emphasize when we have these victim voices. And I also think that her recollections, while obviously very personal and subjective, speaks so powerfully to the different punitive functions that the camps served at the time when she experienced it. She said, quote, "At Ahlem, we were let into a gym and everyone was labeled with a number. Afterward, our suitcases and backpacks were searched and the entire large luggage was handed over. Then we just stood there well into the night, holding hand luggage such as purses and blankets, awaiting further inspection. Our hand luggage was searched, and items like knitting needles, knives, butter, sausages, and sometimes even bread were taken away. After we returned with our half-emptied purses, a strip search followed. Once that was done, we walked away like the poorest beggars to our designated beds." So again, this recollection really emphasizes this final violation and deprivation that she occurred on German ground inside a German camp before being deported to other sites within the camp network. On December 15th, 1941, altogether 1,001 Jews from Hanover were loaded at the Ahlem collection and transit camp onto trucks, and from there transported to a train station in Hanover, where they began a 3-day journey to Riga. In Riga, Nazi authorities had recently cleared out a large ghetto by shooting some 28,000 Jewish residents. As the German deportees from Hanover arrived at the newly cleared ghetto, some were shot or gassed in mobile vans upon arrival, and most were ultimately transferred to the Riga ghetto, but were then killed during subsequent massacres in the spring. Only 68 of the original transport of over 1,000 people survived within the Nazi camp system until liberation. Among that very small group of survivors of the first transport was a survivor by the name of Gerd Landsberg, whom we already met earlier in my talk, as he had spent those months at a Jew house in Hanover before being processed at the transit camp in Ahlem. He was deported to Riga in December 1941 from Ahlem, and I want to spend just a minute on his particular odyssey through the camp system, because I think it shows us just how integrated even a relatively small camp like Ahlem was into the larger camp system spanning all of Europe. So from Ahlem, as I said, Landsberg was transported to the ghetto at Riga. From there, he was transferred to a nearby concentration camp called KZ Kaiserwald, and then Stutthof near Gdansk, before he was ultimately transported back to Germany via the Buchenwald concentration camp. From there, he was moved to a Buchenwald satellite camp in Bochum in Germany, where he served as a forced labor in armaments production. In late March 1945, during Buchenwald's evacuation, Landsberg was transported to the concentration camp Dachau near Munich. And at Dachau, American troops finally liberated the sick, injured, and malnourished survivor nearly 3.5 years after his odyssey through the Nazi camp system began with that very first transport from Ahlem. The Ahlem school continued to serve as an assembly and transit camp for much of the duration of the war. Another 6 transports of altogether 1,200 people were assembled at Ahlem for destinations like Auschwitz and Theresienstadt, with the last deportation of inmates from the Ahlem Jew house occurring as late as February 20th, 1945. That is less than 3 months before Germany's unconditional surrender, emphasizing just how much of a priority the ongoing destruction of the Jewish population was for the Nazi regime, even as its war effort was deteriorating rapidly. During this time, the Ahlem school also served a number of other additional and parallel persecutory functions, including as a German punishment camp for so-called delinquent foreign forced laborers. Finally, members of the 84th U.S. Infantry Division liberated the surviving Jewish inmates and surviving forced laborers who were still imprisoned at the site in April of 1945. But that still, as I said, for many camps, the end of the war was not the end of their operation, even though the operation changed yet again quite dramatically. And that was true also for Ahlem. After the war, it operated as a camp for displaced persons and refugees until at least 1948. And today, among others, it serves as a memorial and museum to the victims of Nazi persecution. The reason that I spent some time here describing this one camp that I would not expect anyone to have heard of before, and certainly probably not remember after this talk, is that I wanted to give you just some sense of how one small and relatively unknown Nazi camp operated on the ground in all its specificity and all its particulars. And yet the point I'd like to make is that no matter how unique a site Ahlem was, it was also an integral part of a wider network of camps that were deployed in the pursuit of destructive Nazi goals. Just by way of context, Ahlem was one of at least 1,500 labor camps for Jews. It was one of several hundred ghettos and residential camps for Jews that operated during the war. And it was, and though it's a transformation from a Jewish self-help haven to a tool of racial persecution and murder was quite unique, it shared various features that were characteristic of many of the Nazi camps in the Nazi persecutory complex in general. As we saw on the example of the Ahlem school, Nazi camps were spaces for the concentration, segregation, and detention of those deemed undesirables or enemies of the so-called national community. In the case of Ahlem, that meant Jews and later Eastern European foreigners. Camps were spaces of systematic exploitation and plunder. They were spaces of degradation and humiliation, and quite frequently, as we saw in the example of Ahlem, exploitation and degradation could go hand in hand, as the inmates experienced, especially those strip searches and other ways of physical harassment as particularly traumatizing. And finally, camps were spaces that served racially based murder and even genocide. For German Jews, Ahlem served as a staging ground for their deportation east, where most of them were killed, while a few others, such as Gerd Landsberg, were exploited and punished as they forcibly traversed the vast Nazi camp universe. In conclusion to this talk, I want to return one more time to historian Nicholas Waxman and his work on the Nazi concentration camps. He recently wrote that, quote, "The concentration camp embodies the spirit of Nazism like no other institution in the Third Reich," end quote. And I think, or at least what I hope to show in this talk here, is that we can apply this assessment more broadly beyond the concentration camp category. Nazi camps, in their many, many destructive incarnations, embodied the spirit of Nazism like no other institution, which I believe makes it imperative that we document and remember them. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to questions later on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lohse. As you were presenting, I was thinking a lot about the research that we did for our exhibition, and so much of what you talked about, so much of the language and the history and the conversation about spaces holding memory and the memory of spaces also belonging very much to the victims is absolutely something that we wrestled with. And so I'd like to transition very briefly to give everyone a sneak peek of our exhibition. The exhibition was curated by Dr. Kerry Lane. He's Associate Professor of English at Queensborough Community College. He's also the KHC's longtime curator in residence. We also did work with Dr. Nicholas Waxman, the historian that Dr. Lohse mentioned. And I also wanted to acknowledge another person who has been very involved in the memory of the camps and documentation of it, Dr. Geoffrey Nabarji. He worked at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for many, many years. He was a friend to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and was one of the world's leading Holocaust and World War II historians, which never, though, prevented him from working with small centers such as ours. So we are very, very grateful for all of his guidance and support. Very briefly, our exhibition focuses on exactly the topic we're talking about today, the Nazi concentration camp system. We're located at the Queensborough Community College campus. Our center is small, but very big in spirit. And so we wanted to help our students and community members understand two very important things about the camp system. One, it is a system of incarceration. It's not just extermination camps. This starts with, as Dr. Lohse has mentioned, detention centers, police stations, ghettos, and then eventually escalates into brothels, forced labor camps, other incarceration sites, concentration camps, and extermination camps. Sorry, we're having a bit of technical trouble as I'm trying to navigate through this at the same time. The second part of this exhibition is to also help our students understand the totality of victims, 6 million Jewish people who were targeted for extinction and extermination, as well as the countless million other victim groups, including Polish and Slavic people, Roma and Sinti people, members of the LGBTQIA+ community, political prisoners, people with disabilities, and the list goes on. Our exhibition is broken up into 6 different parts. This is a virtual tour of our space that gives you a sense of how you can move through it. It also features, and we are very grateful for 13 of the survivors and second generation survivors associated with our center for very many years, recorded their testimonies with us in video right before the pandemic struck in 2020. So since this is a little glitchy and it's hard to take you through, I encourage you to visit our website, which we'll drop into the chat. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed colleague, Dr. Azadi Alai. Dr. Alai is Associate Professor of Psychology at Queensborough Community College. She's also the Faculty Fellow for this year's NEH Colloquium. Dr. Alai's research interests focus on Holocaust education, the psychology of bystander behavior during the Holocaust, and the intersection of media, mass violence, warfare, and genocide. She was also the scholar in residence for our 2017 NEH Colloquium on collaboration and complicity. Dr. Alai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. And thank you so much, Dr. Lohse, for your talk. There were so many things that I was struck by as you were speaking. For our students in particular, I wanted to highlight the slide that you included with the resources from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. That's a great resource that you can use online. I've used it myself for a lot of my research as well. And so that's something that as you mentioned, is free and open. And it's such a great archive to kind of do a deeper dive depending on what perspective students or researchers want to take. I was really struck by your opening remark where you talked about grappling daily with the Nazi camp system. And I was wondering, for our students in particular, if you can reflect on why this matters today, or in other words, right now, what lessons can we draw from in terms of this history for this particular cultural, political kind of, moment, if you will.
Thank you, Azzy. Yes, I will start by saying that I consider myself so privileged and so fortunate that as part of my professional life, I get to help document these sites of persecution, which I already suggested are many more thousands, tens of thousands more than we first knew existed when research on this topic began in earnest. And we continue to uncover more of these sites and more of the dimensions of how they worked, how they operated, and who suffered there. And so I think on a very basic level, it's just such a privilege to be part of essentially a fact-finding mission of a team of fact finders who are extremely well trained, who are working in dozens of languages across hundreds of archives and repositories all over the world to gather the evidence for what happened at these sites that many of us outside the field never even heard of. And I will tell you, it is particularly gratifying to know that we're creating a resource that has been vetted and that combines so much global scholarly expertise to create. I don't want to use the word permanent, but to create an enduring legacy and an enduring record of the horror that was visited upon so many people during the Nazi era. And it is a resource that is useful for scholars as a source of additional information that can lead them into further research. It's a great resource for anyone interested in family history and family research. And it's I think particularly what we take seriously at the museum is our duty to the survivors and their descendants. So many survivors and descendants tell us that the sites that we document here in our series, especially these smaller sites that many people have never heard of, are the sites in which their family members suffered and in which their family members perished. And this is the first time that in writing there is a scholarly record of these events happening.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
I think, facts matter. And that is what we're trying to create, a record of facts.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
I want to build on that, the record of facts, because often when we're talking about the Nazi concentration camp, the word Nazi is in there. And some questions have come in about ownership and the administration of camps. So for example, we have a colleague in South Africa who's asking about the camps in North Africa. And could you talk a little bit about the differences between those camps that were under Italian control versus German control? And someone else also wanted to ask the question about, for example, camps in the East German territory, the GDR, being repurposed after the war by the Russians.
Those are really great points and very complex questions. I will have to direct our audience member to volume 3 of the encyclopedia, which is available for free on our website, which covers the camps that German allied nations operated, and it includes a whole series of camps in North Africa. It's not total, but it's quite comprehensive. We take the question of who operated these camps very seriously, and we understand the many sensitivities that are involved in the subject matter. So, and as part of our mission and mandate, we try to lay out within each entry very specifically, who do we know was involved in the daily operation of this camp? On whose order did it operate? Who were the victims? And whose purpose did this camp serve? Our series also features quite illuminating overview essays that situate these smaller sites within a larger policy and wartime context, so that readers can get a better understanding of why there are German-operated camps on Polish grounds, or why there are, for instance, Ukrainian collaborators helping in a German-operated camp. We're very attuned to these nuances and understand those sensitivities.
Can I add also a follow-up? One of the things that I was really struck by with your case study is that you see the kind of transformation of what that site was being used for as the Nazi policy and the overall concentration camp system also started to transform and become radicalized over time. So I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to some of the factors that served as catalysts or that impacted the same site kinds of changing in terms of what purpose it served, or the repurposing even after the war, for instance. If you can kind of help us trace what decision-making kind of went into the face of the camps kind of changing as Nazi goals or policies also changed.
Sure. As you are undoubtedly aware, there are many debates among scholars about how to trace the origin of the final solution, or what the Nazis called the final solution, and how to assign responsibility and agency, at what level were decisions made that ultimately resulted in really destructive Nazi policies as they played out within these camp settings. In the case, and it can be a very overwhelming and challenging debate and sort of subject matter, I think, especially for the common interest audience to engage with. I think one of the strong suits of our series and our approach is that we're trying to lay it out in very basic terms as to what the evolution of the Nazi dictatorship and the war was. I think it is very hard to overstate the importance of the war as the radicalizer behind many of these racist policies of the Nazi regime that ultimately resulted in genocide. But the series also does a very great job at reminding us that while big decisions were made in Berlin, while the Nazi regime, established its dictatorship and established its or consolidated its police powers that allowed it to implement ever more radical policies, the strength of our series is that it takes it down again to the local level. How did that actually look? And who made the decisions on the local level? And what we find in a lot of camps, or as a context to a lot of camps, is that there was quite a lot of local initiative by true believers of the Nazi ideologies, by local zealots, by people who had any range of motivations, including, economic enrichment or social advancement, to take this general direction of Nazi policy and implement it on the ground by helping go plunder their Jewish neighbors' houses, by revealing hiding places of Jews who didn't conform to their orders to go to a Jew house or ghetto. There was a lot of local initiative that we find is really indispensable in trying to explain how on a local level the radicalization and persecution in these individual sites occurred.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
There's a question that just came in. It's making me think a little bit also, when many of us on the call have been to the larger sites of memory, former extermination camps, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Mauthausen, but there are as you mentioned, over 40,000 different kinds of camps. And so often these are places where there might not be a memorial anymore, where people in the community might have a memory, but not necessarily want to invite people who are visiting to go take a look. Could you talk a little bit about some of the challenges of memorializing this kind of system?
Sure, that's a great question, and I will say that while as you saw in my talk on Ahlem, we do try to capture a little bit of what happened to a former Nazi camp in the post-war era. Our mandate really stops at 1945, and it's a bit of an unfortunate but necessary stopping point. Otherwise, as I said, the afterlife of these camps would necessitate essentially a whole new series of documentation. But yeah, so what we find is a very mixed and uneven phenomenon, and it's still ongoing. And I think that's something that makes me excited to be part of this team of documentation, because once we have the documentation for sites of persecution, it can often serve as an impetus for other ways of memorializing and remembering these sites. So in a lot of places we find, for instance, in Germany, in these, what I call, which it's unfortunately is a Nazi term, Jew houses, the Judenhäuser, there was not much memorialization of these sites as opposed to, the memorialization of concentration camps and the better known camps, as you mentioned, Laura. But only in recent decades, there have been a lot of local initiatives to at least put a plaque or a Stolperstein, one of those little rocks in the pavement, to acknowledge what happened at this site. In other places, you find greater reluctance to memory and commemoralization. It is very uneven. Again, I'm very gratified that we're part of a project that may lay the foundation for broader memorialization. And certainly the encyclopedia as a whole, we consider as not only a scholarly document, but a memorial to these sites.
Thank you. Ozzy, would you like to?
No, I'm overwhelmed. Thank you. I was just answering some of the questions in the Q&A, and I just wanted to take another opportunity to thank you specifically for identifying the resources that our students can draw on, the mission behind the work that you're doing, and also the collaboration globally in terms of scholars from all over the world, which we also apparently have audience members from all over the world based on the questions, which is also gratifying to see. And that's a testament to your talk and your name as our guest speaker. So I really thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just want to echo Ozzy's sentiments. Something I've been thinking about, and it was a question that came in, is what's it like for you as a woman, as a scholar? It's the middle of the day, and we've been talking about some of the most gruesome things, and we're all going to get off the call and go about our lives. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the work's impact on you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we each, are challenged by the reality of the subject matter that we work in different ways and learn different coping mechanisms. I think a lot of scholars and a lot of researchers in this topic find that there are some topics or some aspects of the topic that they have a harder time compartmentalizing or processing than others. I think for a lot of people, sexual violence within the camp setting or violence against children is particularly challenging, and there's no way that will ever become a regular part of anyone's work routine. But I think I can only speak for myself, but I imagine it is true for other scholars in this field as well. At the end of the day, we remember why we do this work. It is not an indulgence. It is not just a reveling in human misery, but it is documentation and creating an enduring record. And I think that's how we all end up managing this really traumatic subject matter.
Thank you. I feel the same way, and I think that we're going to bring up a slide that shows all of the people that were involved in our exhibition. You referred to all of the people at USHMM that have been involved with this effort over many, many years and documenting all of these sites. And I think that when we think of individual sites that may be lost in communities where there's no memorial, the memory, though, lives with those of us that start to learn about this history and communicate it to others. And I think that right now, when there's so much misinformation and Holocaust distortion continues to grow, I think that education isn't necessarily the panacea to fix it, but it is a way to make sure that this memory stays alive in contemporary culture and people understand its significance to now. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. And here is a list of the many, many people who were involved with our exhibition. Many people, especially from Alexandra's team, again, wanted to thank in memory of Dr. Jeffrey Magarji, people including Andrew Close, Christine Brown, Carolyn Waddell, Nancy Hartman from the photo archive team. We've got hundreds of photos that came from USHMM, Dr. Carrie Lane, our curator in residence, and a very strong team, and always to thank the survivors who are at the heart of this exhibition. On behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, we greatly appreciate all of you joining us today, and we hope that you stay safe and be well.